1 minute.
So we're going to start. So we're trying to get everybody in. So the last speaker of this afternoon is Frode Steen, and while he's getting his computer ready, I will say a few words about him. He was first student at Brockwood Park, which is a Krishnamurti school in England. Then he taught for a while at Ogro School, and now he's a professor at UCLA, communication studies. And he has a long-term interest in Krishnamurti, obviously. He is board member of the Krishnamurti Foundation of America, and he is very intensely involved with the teacher education program in India, Krishnamurti education. So, well, give the word to Frode.
Okay, thank you. So let's see if it looks like, I don't know if someone knows how to operate this thing. We can just switch to
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so one of the issues that comes up when I'm in now in social sciences at UCLA, the communication studies, there's
Just put your mouth up.
yeah, I just need to be really close. Okay. I actually do quite a bit of work also with people in other sciences, in neuroscience, and in computational sciences, and so on. And one of the issues that comes up is what is the relation between the kind of interests that I've spent developing at Brockwood, here in Ojai, in Rishi Valley in India, and so on, with Krishnaji and with all of you. And it raises a series of questions that we may tend to think that Krishnamurti is the sort of maybe this fringe event, and science is the big engine of our civilization, and they have a coherent view of what they're doing, and we are this little group trying to sort of do something in a different sphere, as it were, right? But what I'd like to point out is that the kind of attention to the actual processes of the human mind that characterizes Krishnamurti's work is something that is urgently needed in the sciences. So if we look at what could be the relation between the work that scientists are doing and the work that we're interested in, right? That we're interested in here among ourselves in dialogue, exploring our own minds in education, right? And the work of science, what could possibly relate these two areas? And a central interest that we have here is, can the human mind transform? Right? Can we understand more deeply what we are, and in that process, in that perception, change? Right? Now, this is not something that we think of as a scientific project. Science doesn't tend to think of its own kind of goals in terms of this sort of transformation. But what I'd like to draw attention to is that many of the obstacles that science is faced with, right? The real problems that scientists are really struggling with, they are deeply tied in with this issue. Krishnamurti himself talked about science in a number of ways. In many contexts, he spoke about it as a positive force. But he also, in a sense, bracketed the positive vision of science within the fact of the confusion of the human mind. So as long as we are divided, as long as we are in conflict, science exacerbates that conflict, makes it more dangerous, we produce more weapons to destroy each other, right? The technology becomes a real threat to human welfare. And he also speaks of science as, in a sense, that the religious mind encompasses the scientific mind. Right? The religious mind, in a sense, means actually paying attention to what is. And at its best, this is what science is supposed to do. Right? So if you think of the sort of larger mission of science, right? It is to face the facts, to go beyond belief, to go beyond authority, and to discover what is true. Right? And it's the key heart of the mandate of science is to discover what is true. Now, that aspect of the knowledge of science, right, to discover what is true, part of that is empiricism, right? You say, look, we pay attention to what is actually happening. We don't simply read in a book that this is true. We don't take someone's word for it. We go and investigate. Right? Science also has a whole series of other concepts that we would need to engage with in some way. So, for instance, science has this idea that the world can be understood in terms of laws. Right? Now, part of that is an underlying assumption that is not merely to face the facts, right, to see the truth, but that there is something kind of mechanistic about the world. Right? So that is a kind of additional assumption. Right? And one could imagine doing science without that assumption. Science also has this idea of the scientific method. Part of the scientific method is to be objective, right? And to propose hypotheses and test them, and to, in a sense, weed out all of the confusion that our personal perspectives bring into knowledge. So what this means is that the scientific method, in this sort of roundabout way, acknowledges that the human mind is confused. And part of the reason we need the scientific method is that there is this tendency of scientists to become attached to their ideas, to not be biased in their perspectives, to not see clearly what's happening. Right? So the scientific method, in that indirect sense, if you see what I'm getting at, is kind of acknowledging there's a problem with the mind. Right? But we've found a solution, and we're going to work around that problem, and we call it the scientific method. And it will allow us to find the truth in spite of all the confusion in the mind. It's a method. Now, so you can see that's sort of a cute way of looking at things, and then you can ask about how successful was this? Right? How good has science been at excluding confusion? Right? And what you find is that science has, over the centuries, struggled with confusions that appear to have been introduced and sustained why people's sense of self, thinking that we are at the center of the universe, and the scientific theories have then been sort of tacitly in accordance with these views that place us in the center. So it took hundreds of years, right? In fact, more, like 1,500 years, right? For astronomers to realize, the Earth is not in the center of the universe. It was a vicious fight to finally end that conviction. Now, of course, there were institutions outside of science that participated in this, but this was, right, the dominant scientific thesis for a very long time. Science also, in biology, you can see this sort of parallel phenomenon where scientists and lay people have been drifting towards the kind of preferred way of looking at things, that we are the result of an act of special creation. Right? So we are unique in the world. God created us directly, right? Adam, like that, right? And the scientific evidence, of course, is massive, that we are an integrated part of all of creation, right? And every cell in our body is part of the same history, and we share like 75% of my genes with flies, right? This is very deep. It was very hard to, in fact, this fight is to some degree still going on, right? Although it's not very active among scientists, there's still a struggle. Even in physics, right? So these are areas that don't even look at the mind, right? They're looking at the stars, right? They're looking at all of life, and they're looking here at physics at the quantum level, right? This is Schrödinger's cat, the still dominant scientific theory of in quantum physics, right, is that our act of, our conscious act of looking at this cat to determine whether it's dead or alive, collapses the wave function and makes it dead or alive. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that the idea that we can remove our inner confusion from our scientific projects, right, just historically doesn't hold water. Right? But what actually happens is that this confusion massively infects everything that scientists do, and they're not able to use scientific method to clean it up. Right? Now, an aspect of science kind of working hypothesis is dualism. Dualism is again not simply an integral part of science, in the sense that you don't have to be a dualist to be interested in the truth, right? But science has adopted dualism, in a sense, from our kind of folk psychology models of the mind, right? So the self you can think of as kind of folk psychology theory of how the mind works. And the theory says there's a little spirit inside the head. He looks out of the eyes, right? Looks out. Right? Not that the light comes in, but he looks out. And in introspection, he kind of turns around. He's right behind the eyeball. And in introspection, he turns around and he looks inside. Okay? Chances of that being correct, right? Not very high, right? But this is the default model, not just of sort of the person in the street, right? This is the default model of the scientist. And science doesn't tell them to examine this, like pay attention to it. And you can't just have a theory that it isn't that way, right? You have to look at it, right? So again, dualism kind of pits the scientist against this external world that's machine-like, whereas I'm creative, I'm the spirit, right? I'm mind, and then the world out there is mechanical. Now, this is not an empirical theory. This is no basis in fact, right? This is superstition. Now, it's one thing to try to develop a clear science when you're looking at the stars, when you're looking at life, when you're looking at physics, and what history suggests is that it doesn't actually work even there to try to exclude yourself and exclude your own mental processes from the process of developing a deep understanding of these domains. But in the area of psychology, how could you conceivably even begin to develop the coherent theory of the mind? when you completely disregard your own mental operations. Okay? So this just doesn't work. Right? So what you see in psychology is a kind of general abandonment. I mean, a general sort of like people have basically given up on the idea of understanding the mind in a kind of holistic manner, like in the sense of understanding the whole mind, how the whole thing works. Okay? What you get in psychology, graduate school in psychology, right, is intense methodological training. Basically what you do, right? And then these correlation studies, little itty bitty things of things, right, that correlate. In cognitive science, you have a similar type of phenomenon. Very hard issues, right? Mind is hard to understand, right? Hard to integrate into our the rest of our understanding of the world. And cognitive science has latched onto the idea that the mind is like a computer. And that everything that happens, right, is studied very sort of objectively, right? Everything that happens is these sort of, what I call low-dimensional representations of, everything is sort of zeros and ones, or maybe language, and the sort of theories like individual neurons that are stupid, but they hook up into large networks, and then the networks produce some intelligence, and they know how to model it. I mean, we actually do know how to model that in detail. We can build computers that work that way, neural networks and so on. Right? It's just no evidence that the brain works that way. Okay? The role of the rich dimensions of human experience are basically cut out of this model. Right? They don't know what to do with it. Right? It doesn't fit the computational model. So in what we call classical computationalism, you can imagine, sensory information comes in, goes into this computer-like mind, is processed. There's no awareness of what's of the real computational process, right? And then you get behavior out. And then as a kind of, this is a bit hard to explain because it's so counterintuitive that you may find it difficult to believe that scientists really think this is how the mind works, right? But this is the dominant mainstream model. Right? That everything in our experience is sort of like the vapor of this sort of the real computational machine in our minds. And it has no consequences, right? In other words, there's no error pointing back from our experience back into behavior, for instance, right? So you don't eat because you're hungry, you don't smile because you see a child, right? The experience has no significance on your behavior. It's hard to even wrap your mind around it, right? But it means that we now have the dominant theory in cognitive science of how the mind works, right? Basically claims that all of our experience, all the rich dimensions, multiple dimensions of our experience are epiphenomena, right? Parasitical, they have no consequence on behavior. Now you can wonder, how can people think this? How can cognitive scientists really take this theory seriously? Right? An interesting kind of aspect of this is that they can't be paying attention, right? Because this is sort of like they are actually talking about what is happening in consciousness, right? They make theories about it. They get tenure because they publish stuff on it and so on. Right? And what they're saying in these publications is that what is happening in consciousness has no consequence for cognition. So how could it generate books? How could you even talk about it if it has no consequence? It just it does not make any sense, right? So the handicap that we face, right? Because we're in a culture where it's not considered significant at all to pay attention to what your mind is actually doing, right? And to take your own mind seriously and to say that, yes, there is confusion, but instead of just creating a method out there to kind of work around it, why don't we face it, right? Why don't we actually look at it? That's a big handicap that prevents us from actually making progress in science, because instead you get these really absurd theories. So we can say that, well, we've managed with a lot of work to sort of excerpt the self from astronomy. It's no longer at the center of astronomy in the sense of, say, we're at the center of the universe and everything is around. We managed to sort of excerpt it out of extracted out of biology by saying, yes, we're part of this huge process of nature, vast process of the natural world. But it's still at the heart of psychology, right? And because it's still at the heart of psychology, and it's at the heart of, in a sense, everyday life of scientists, it in practice infects every aspect of science. And it's a handicap. It's not like it benefits anyone. Right? It's not like it's to the advantage of scientists to have these weird illusions. Right? It's not like we're sort of doing someone a favor by saying, yes, you think that, and that's sort of good for you somehow. Right? Now, so the underlying problem here is that scientists, in a sense, acknowledge through the scientific method, as I was suggesting, right? There's this kind of tacit acknowledgement that, yes, the human mind is confused. It does introduce confusion, right? And you find things like, people tend to be very kind of attached to their point of view. So they develop some theory. They get, published and hired because of some particular perspective in science. And then they say, well, that's my theory. And if you speak against it, I'm going to defend it. Right? And the process is completely irrational, right? And very, very widespread. Right? Even in the kind of normal, was that a comment? Or?
No.
Yeah?
A fly.
If you think of, so you feel free to comment. If you think of another kind of pervasive aspect of science that involves our internal confusion, right, is that whenever you select a particular topic to study, whenever you propose a particular hypothesis, that hypothesis is guided by your sense of what is valuable, what is worth doing. Science doesn't just go out and study things willy-nilly. You don't go out on the beach and sort of say, look, we need a big National Science Foundation to count the number of grains of sand here. Right? These are directed by value. And the value is, of course, completely then a function of how you see yourself, your own, how your mind actually operates. Right? So in that pervasive way also, science gets drawn into this confusion. Now, the evidence, right? So what I'm suggesting is that science is, in a sense, infected by a whole series of superstitions and kind of beliefs that are just conditioning, if you want to use a case term, right? Affected by these different types of conditioning. And the evidence, if you actually pay attention to what's happening, you don't have dualism. There's no empirical evidence for dualism. And it's really the mainstream, people might say, Krishnamurti crowd, that's the sort of woo-woo crowd, they believe in this, or they have these all ideas, right? But science is really woo-woo, right? You have these weird ideas about how the mind works. Typically implicit, tacit, but they are the idea that the unexamined ideas that drive science. Now, how do you begin to deal with this? Right? So this is where I see a role for transformation within science. The way in which scientists' minds work, the way in which scientists' minds work is not simply a function of a kind of explicit theory, an explicit belief. Right? It's really baked into the mind of the scientist. So it's not enough to kind of substitute some other content and say, we're going to reprogram people and tell them that, when you're a scientist, you should not be dual of the self as an illusion. And it's like, no, it's not going to work, right? You can't just add some sort of content on top of the current situation. Right? what you actually need to do is scientists need to actually pay attention to what is happening with their own life. There's no way around it. Right? There's no other effective solution. If we extend this to higher education in general, I mean, of course, also at primary, secondary school level, right? But the point is at the top levels of education, right? The process of actually paying attention to how does your mind work? What are the actual processes? Can you, in a sense, begin to have an insight into how your mind works to begin to correct the confusion that's happening? That's going to have a much bigger impact on science than any proposed methodology to correct this. And the disciplines can then, in a sense, be given a chance to transform, so that taking a course in psychology, which undergraduates flock to psychology courses because they want to understand themselves, like they have a real interest in a sense of transforming. I want to understand, I want to see, I want to, in a sense, be different from my understanding. Right? And then they're taught, all right, you have statistics first, and then all these correlational studies, and you need to be objective, and keep yourself out of it. And, right? They really don't get what they want. So if we could instead have a transformative psychology where you say, yes, we're really going to be empiricists, we're actually going to face what the real facts of the mind is, right? Then I think people will also find, students would find it much more meaningful. Right? So at least my experience with my own undergraduates, it took me a bit by surprise that at UCLA, people come in, and, hard to get in, and competitive, and that kind of thing. But the students are, in addition to looking for all kinds of other things, they're also looking for wisdom, for insight, for a deep understanding. Right? So I feel that there is a real potential for doing something very different at a university level that would be deeply informed by a meditative, a contemplative practice, and an understanding that places an inner revolution at the heart of the whole university enterprise. Of course, this is not what's happening, right? I'm just saying, this is where the logic of actually discovering the truth takes you. Similarly, in education, more broadly, the educational process is typically studied very sort of objectively. Right? I have lots of friends in education talk about how you sort of step aside from the process and see the students, sort of as, in a sense, separate from yourself. Right? But we could imagine doing a far more participatory type of education, where part of the exploration is that the students learn about their own minds, learn about how they learn, and they become fully qualified sort of interlocutors with the researchers. And would this still be science? Right? Would we still want to call this science? So my point is just that science has kind of deep features that we could still, in a sense, claim that yes, the search for truth is at the heart of science, and all these other kind of more peripheral stowaways, if you like, right? Dualism, the self, and so on, that kind of hitchhike their ride, and we can say no, that's not essential to the program of science, right? Scientific practice can then be reconceived in the sense of saying, instead of saying, look, the method will secure that none of this confusion seeps into our theories. Instead we say, no, history shows that we cannot keep the confusion from seeping into our theories. It massively affects all our theories, right? And instead we can say, look, we need to take the confusion directly. We need to actually investigate it, and not as something outside of ourselves, but part of the process that we are, and thereby allow the perception, the sort of the search for truth, in a sense, right, to inform our relation with ourselves and with each other, and allow it to transform scientific practice. All right, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, any comments and questions? I thought we'd sort of leave some time for it. Thinking about this.
So what about like Bruce Lipton and how he's a scientist and he's kind of gone out into the deep space of consciousness and merging those two, like Greg Braden and Jill Bolte Taylor. So they seem to be breaking out of that structure of science. So it's really confirming. They're confirming what you're saying. Big time.
Yeah, so I mean, there clearly are a growing group of people who are interested in moving in this direction.
Yeah.
Especially in areas that have to do with health, there's quite a bit of interest in this because the science is in part pragmatic, so we look at what works.
Right.
And so if you look at neuroscience and health and so on, look, this is actually what's going on. I mean, actually paying attention to your real processes and being changed by an insight into your own life, it actually happens. So there is a kind of pragmatic incentive to move in this direction.
I sort of wonder if students go through a process of transformative science or whatever, something like that, if they would be able to do science.
Whether it says get rid of science. Yeah. But I mean, I think you can think of reality as sort of multi-level, right? So there are aspects of our existence that are predictable. When you want hot water, you turn on the hot water tap, and you don't do all kinds of other things, right? Part of the appeal of the notion of transformative science to me is, in a sense, to sort of begin to clarify what are the aspects that we want to describe as recurring, and what are the aspects that we want to describe in a sense as, more in the direction of art, right? Where you have an insight and it changes things, and that changes the direction, right? But of course, we know that human life is that, right? And having an integration of art and science as part of a unified process would not really be a bad thing, right?
Yeah, great. That'd be amazing.
Yes, you should.
Are you able in your teaching in school, in university, to incorporate this into your teaching, or do you have to follow a pattern that's old, or is it a combination of both?
So it's a mixture. So especially with people that I work with very closely in a sustained way, like research assistants and people I sort of part of my research projects and so on. Right? There we can really go into this in great depth. So one of my graduate students went with me to Rishi Valley, and we spent 2 months there. Right? So you can do things like that, right? He's now in education and is amazed going to educational conferences and finding that people are so attached to their theories and what's going on. That they can't make progress and they can't talk to each other because they're so attached to their ideas, right? In my smaller classes, I can also do a certain amount of things. But to really get into this, you have to be able to do it in a sustained way, right? It does require the kind of persistent engagement over time to allow them to really get a feel for this direction. Yeah, you do need a certain amount of immersion and seeing from multiple angles and so on, right?
You said you were in Rishi Valley for how long?
2 months.
2 months. But explain maybe a little about what was the transformative quality of what happened when you were there.
Well, I mean, part of what we did was we looked at this is sort of off on the side, but just to give an example, right? We did a lot of work on emotion. Emotion is a particularly interesting topic because it's been hard to get for science, right? There is quite a bit of work now on emotion, some of it actually quite good. But there's almost nothing on the actual experience of emotion. Right? So like, fear feels very different from sorrow and joy and so on. And the emotions have a huge range, right? And it turns out there's like nothing that describes this, that even begins to, in a sense, talk about what is it that we're feeling, right? So we came up with a bunch of ideas in Rishi Valley for actually drawing emotions. Take an outline of your body, right, and drawing. And we did workshops at CFL. I actually just did them at Brockwood. And I do that in my classes, right? And they're really, really fun. You know, I could show you some pictures of what students have drawn, right? But that kind of, you know, you give it as a homework, and you can, you know, they can go home and say, you know, either call up or catch yourself when you're having a strong feeling, and then draw it. And then we can share. And part of the powerful experience was that, you know, when you see other people actually openly talking about their emotions and drawing them and so on, I thought that I was the only one having these very confusing emotions, and strong emotions and so on, right? And it gives people a sense of, you know, in a sense, saying that, yes, the inner world isn't just something random and idiosyncratic and so on, right? It's orderly. The way in which we perceive the world is orderly, right? The whole idea that the subjective is something that, you know, is this sort of hyper unreliable sphere is nonsense. And so that's one example, right? But we did lots of other things.
So how do you do this research? Like just discussing with people, or like a scientist, you know, you can do experiments in the lab, you know, prediction particle, and this psychological stuff, how you do it, just talking to people, and how you come to the conclusion that this is right or this is wrong, this is better.
Right. So, I mean, it's really an integrated process, right? So part of what I'm suggesting in the sort of virtues, the necessity of bringing in, you know, direct attention to your own mental processes is not that that's the end of science, but that that is a requirement for doing decent science, right? So if you can pay attention to your mental processes, you may notice, you know, when you're defending a position, even though it's not really justified. You may notice you're preferring a certain theory out of some idiosyncratic reason that isn't actually, you know, true to the facts. You may be able to understand how things hang together in a much more coherent way than if you just adopt the sort of, as if it were this barrier between yourself and the sort of supposedly objective thing out there. I mean, a very pervasive thing in science, for instance, is the idea that there is this sort of objective world outside of us, which is identical to the world that we perceive, and then there is the mental world. And, you know, it's a basic fact of neuroscience that the so-called external world that we perceive, right, every feature of it is brain state, right? It's produced by the brain. Like light comes into your eyes, is processed up in your brain, generates reality. Right? Now, it's slightly counterintuitive. We need to sort of go into it and so on, right? But there's no controversy about it. Right? Like that's not a sort of far out sort of guru speculation, right? No, this is what happens, right?
So what you're saying, there really is no separation. Like we think there's a separation between like the outside world and then the our world, but really you're saying it's all one.
Well, it's literally all one. I mean, when I experience the room as outside of myself, right? That's some kind of attribution process. Right? It's literally my brain generating it.
Yeah.
Right?
I guess so.
I mean, in a very straightforward scientific sense, right? So if you begin to look at things in this kind of more integrated way, right? Suddenly things will begin to make sense to you, and also people's theories. Like you sort of begin to adopt the view of the 7 blind men and the elephant. Right? So yeah, you have a theory, and you're all fighting with each other, God forbid, right? You know, attached to a particular perspective. But you say, no, I understand now that these are different aspects of the phenomenon. So you get a richer understanding, right? This was originally a Jain insight, right? It came up with Anekampavada, means no single perspective.
That's good.
Right? They came up with the story of the 7 blind men and the elephants to illustrate this. Right? Those may be
Oh, I was struck by when I learned that in Thailand the monks go to elementary schools and to teach basic mindfulness and Eightfold Path. And I spent 7 years teaching high school. And I tried to do some of that, but with the teenage brain in a public school, that's just none of it stuck.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, well, if they got from elementary school, just kind of have introductions that maybe we got more in depth at the high school.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge here is to do it in such a way that it makes sense to the kids, that it empowers the kids, they understand more, the world makes more sense. Right? I mean, that's partly what I'm seeing with my students, like scales falls from their eyes and they say, wow. The academic environment makes sense, right? Because you understand it really what's really going on.
No, but Sammy had said about, sorry, saying that it's all one. That brought to mind how that could become a theory too, that then it's sort of, it's actually outside, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And it seems like, so that we don't come to that perception by thinking, well, one and not separate. That's an idea then, and maybe this is where the negation of the process of negation.
Yeah, so part of the that's right. So part of the difficulty is, you've got to actually do it. Okay? You can't just have an idea about it. You can't just have some, again, like you were saying, right? It means children actually have to engage in kind of contemplative practice, paying attention to their own minds. It's not a matter of just kind of indoctrinating them in a new way.
So one other thing, just to extend what you said for this. So when you bring it to experience, and then you bring it to experience of the mind and mental states, I see it's related to this kind of danger that again it sustains that division. So I'm going back to the word, facing the facts, and that word fact sort of shares the same root as manufacture. So the world is there for the making too, right? So in that sense, so if you just ask, just a fun project, you ask, how many sides to a box, right? Not just about mental states. And kids come up with all kinds of answers. They come up with 6 sides. They come up with 10 sides, box without a lid, inside, outside, 12 sides, right? And those are different experiences of the world, right? So one way to investigate that is to actually engage with those experiences, not only experiences of emotional and internal states, but how the world is experienced. And actually, if you begin to ask that, if you touch a box, figure out what is a side and what's an edge? What's your experience of the side of an edge? What's your knowledge of the side of an edge? That throws open a whole area of questions where it's participatory not only for internal emotional states, but it's participatory in remaking the world.
Right. So, I mean, that's a really important point, right? There's a big tradition in education, for instance, about situated cognition. And what they do is they say, well, we can say nothing about cognitive processes. All learning happens, in a social environment and outside and so on, right? But the point is that this isn't a different thing, right? This is just as cognitive, right? Looking at a box and learning with your environment. This is how our minds work, right? There isn't a division between, the sort of mental state thing in here and then the external world out there.
It's as cognitive as worldly as you like.
Yeah.
And at this point from subjectivity, the cutting edge, from deep subjective experiencing, before it turns into words or concept, how much of is that willful act, that the objectivity means concept is in some way a form, which could call an objective. It could be very fluid at the beginning, but from subjective experience itself, the words and speech follows, right? So how does that word the instantaneous subjective experience by nature, somehow the instance, it stands still in the instant to be captured by some mechanism to turn into words and forms. So if experientially we see that, right? How fast it turns into conceptualization, which we call objectivity. So how do you see the subject-object phenomena if that was the case, is the case according to experience or some people like me, if velocity and the force and all those elements work, which is not our willful act.
Right, so I'm not sure if I understand all the different points you're making, but one aspect of this is that we do need to, in a sense, revise our understanding of what the mind is. The university, for instance, is really quite committed to the idea that the mind is essentially thought. So that the product of the work of people in the university is seen as thought. Right? And that's part of the difficulty with transformation. Like transformation happens before thought. It happens in perceptions faster. Right? And that means that in some sense we need to kind of acknowledge that the process of the mind goes beyond and is in a sense prior to, faster than thought itself.
The perception now is in question or awareness, right? At this point, would you say that?
Say that again.
And the question of perception and awareness at this point is very crucial.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Would you say something?
Yeah. So that's exactly right. That the point is that the awareness, and especially when it comes to the actual mental processes themselves, right? There is no substitute for it. Right? There isn't an ideology, a dogma, a method, a teaching. Right? This is part of sort of truth is pathless land, if you like, right? This sort of idea that you can't simply follow a series of steps, right? You actually have to look, and that does break with a whole series of sort of assumptions, right, within the university as an institution. But it's not clear that it really is, in a sense, destructive of that institution. I mean, it seems to me still that it's still a kind of health-bringing a new insight that would allow the university to really become a transformative institution instead of only being devoted to creating knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? So knowledge, in a sense, has to be seen a little more lightly, something that you spin off, limited validity, useful for certain purposes. But at the heart of the enterprise is awareness, is perception.
So how are you bringing this into where you're at?
I mean, I've described it a little bit, right? So I mean, in the area that I haven't talked about so far is neuroscience, and we work with Marco Iacoboni, who works on mirror neurons. So we actually just ran a study now over in the winter, as a brain scan. The difficulty in working with fMRI, brain scans, and so on, right, is very inaccurate. Right? So you've got limited what information you can get. You have to be very inventive to come up with good ways of actually seeing something meaningful. But on the part of Iacoboni, in our discussions with him and some of his students and so on, right, he is very open to these perspectives. Right? He says, like, I'm mystified that my discipline doesn't take human experience and consciousness more seriously. He agrees that this whole sort of folk psychology of the self and so on has no basis in neuroscience. Right? It hinders a real understanding of what you're understanding or what you're investigating. Right?
Yeah.
So people are open, right?
So you find colleagues, you find other colleagues. Yeah. That's awesome.
Absolutely, you find lots of colleagues that you can connect to in different ways. Yeah.
Are there grants to do MRI studies and things like that?
UCLA had what they call a transdisciplinary initiative that was from the Senate, the Academic Senate, and the Office of Research. And I was on 10% of those grants last year. And these are sort of grants to encourage cross-disciplinary type collaboration. So the difficulty is actually not so much the grants and the funding and so on, right? The difficulty is more along the lines of what you experience in the sense of, how do you create an environment where this kind of investigation can really be sustained, so that people can get a deep enough understanding that they can carry it with them, right? And once they're on their own engine, right, then they'll do incredible things, right? But you have to, give it enough time that they can sort of fire on their own. So,
I don't know if it's correctly used. I was a little curious because Sami expressed it in terms of the mind, and you're saying there's no difference between the mind and the inner world. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more. Were you surprised by that? What kind of empathy why did you bring that? I guess the thinking. Could you say more?
Sure. Well, I always thought it was different, and like my whole life, I thought like I had my world, and then I had this other world that I had to try to fit into, but I really didn't want to. And then I realized when he said that really it's all one. So really, my world, I could have just, accepted that, but I didn't, and now I do.
but that's a really nice perspective, though, because I think a lot of people have the sense, that I have to fit in, and I'm this, I'm this separate world, and then you have this world out there, and it's hostile. Sometimes people would say, well, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and you've got to, become mean yourself, or you've got to become something, right?
Yeah.
And if instead you begin to sort of have this appreciation that the outer world is deeply an aspect of this whole, unified movement, right? Then in a sense, maybe you could have a sense of creativity, and that's in a sense, also what, how do you actually do it in the university and so on, right? And the answer is, there's lots of little chinks in the armor in the sense, right? Even people who, in a sense, in their daily lives are committed to one way of thinking about things. If you have if you don't sort of shut them out, you have an inclusive view of it, then often, then suddenly there's an opening. In some area of their life, there's this possibility where suddenly they see something.
I'm glad I realized it now, rather than later.
But it's a very good thing, to just think of that as a kind of characteristic sort of adolescent kind of puzzle in a sense, right? And maybe to directly take that up in with people in high school and say, how do you view your relation to the world, right? How do we actually deal with this sense of
A lot of people.
It's an adult puzzle too.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so.
Sure.
It comes up in an interesting way in my life with a 2-year-old that I have in the room. Because this whole thing that, what psychology has done with the self and feelings, and to know thyself is to come to, say, understand your anger, I am angry, and to own it as something of yourself, not the self, right? And then this, whole other kind of way that we're talking about, and in dealing with everyone, myself, but very young children, and a young child who's in my life, say, suddenly, he's feeling angry about something, or I'm calling it anger. And at first I could see my impulse, was maybe to help him, identify it, name it. You're feeling angry, and then wait a minute, what am I doing with that? And what would be another response? And would it just be how I respond, and sort of encompass that, whatever's going on for him, rather than trying to help him identify and name it and see if it's a property of himself.
I think
it's been a really interesting exploration.
But I think, very broadly, it's a very interesting question, right? Because what I was calling sort of folk psychology model of the self, right, came emerged at some point. Like it seems to be, pretty much spread out throughout the whole world. Means, it's at least in the order of, let's say, 70, 80,000, probably at least 100,000 years old, right? So, pretty much every human group seems to have it, right? So what's it doing, right? Why is it there? Right? Woody Allen has a really funny joke about it in Annie Hall, right? He says, look, you know, I don't know what to do with my brother. He thinks he's a chicken, right? So the guy says, well, you know, you should have him treated, right? He says, well, you know, maybe, but we need the eggs. So yeah, so his brother, you know, I'm telling you about my brother. I'm worried about my brother, right? He thinks he's a chicken,
Right.
right? And you say, well, why don't you have him treated? And I said, well, I would, but we need the eggs. So the idea that there's some sort of feeling that, you know, yeah, the self is this myth, it's a delusion, but somehow we need the eggs.
Right.
I think it's a lot. I know how that is. My mom did that to me all the time. Like, you're feeling sad. You're doing this. I think it's because they don't want to recognize that they're actually sad, so they put it out on you to make it feel like that isn't their problem. So they put it out on the child, and they say, you know, you're feeling like this. This is how you're feeling. But really, like, I'm not feeling like that. I'm feeling the exact opposite every time she says that. And, like, I know she's feeling, I shouldn't say she, because then I'm contradicting myself. But I'm just saying that it's probably why they do that, because that's probably how they feel, and they don't want to say, you know, I feel like that, because a lot of people don't want to admit they feel a certain way.
Maybe it makes us feel more secure to put it in a nice little box,
Right,
you know, explain what something's happening, what's happening.
An interesting little sort of anecdotal finding from the emotion seminar I did at Brookwood was that the adults had kind of convoluted emotions. So emotions overlaying other emotions, and you know, I shouldn't feel this way, and then there's this other, all this sort of convolutions, right? And the younger students had very kind of simple, straightforward emotions, right? So dealing with emotions is, you know, both sort of interpersonally in a sense, right? And just in our relations with how we experience emotions directly, right? Is also an area that I think would be very interesting to just go into more deeply and explore as, like, you know, kind of a real factual part of what we are, and to understand more deeply, you know, how is it we're feeling what we're feeling, and what is the significance of that, and how do emotions travel between people, all kinds of interesting stuff happening. But I also wanted to raise the point that with very young children, like Maxwell, there are, you know, processes that generate the psychological structures that then become, you know, that is the sort of the normal structure, right? And because these structures have been around for a long time, in a sense, we don't really know, as a fact, that we can, you know, intervene in some way, provide a different environment, or in some ways engage with the child in such a way that they will then structure their psychology differently. And how that psychology would look like, we don't know a lot about, right? So, I mean, in some ways, I feel that humanity has been for so long on this path of, you know, structuring our psychology as if there was a self. Right? And even beginning to think, you know, what would the mind look like from birth if we managed to kind of engage with that from very early on.
So, in any form, could you explore and say something about the deconstruction of the structures as it appears, its relationship with awareness and perception?
Well,
I'm thinking there's a big work, you know, construct, it also deconstruct itself in the moments, right?
Yeah. So in the adult mind, you know, sort of people have worked on this for a long time, to put it that way, right? That you know, through meditation, slowing things down, paying attention. You know, Kay described a whole series of sort of you know, made a whole series of suggestions as to what one can do: trace a particular thought, you know, not suppress a desire, allow it to come out, and so pay attention to it. Right? So with the adult mind, I think the kind of unfolding of this mental content can allow you to have an insight into the sort of underlying structure. What I feel we know much less about, in a sense, is how to, in some ways, incorporate that into into infancy, into childhood. And we know children go through the terrible twos, the sort of formation of the self. Right? Well, what's our alternative? Right? Are we saying that people have to go through that and then they can kind of deconstruct? Or are we saying that, well, maybe not? Right? Maybe we can allow the child, give the child appropriate information that allows them to organize their mind differently from the beginning. Any other issues, or should we wind up?
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.